Old Testament speaks much of God's temple, God's dwelling place, but in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 22, we learn about God's new temple in Christ. This passage emphasizes Gentiles being welcomed into God's people. Paul elsewhere talks about how Jew and Gentile come together in the same terms. You see that in Romans, where both Jews and Gentiles are equally lost, and then God provides salvation for both of them through Christ. And you also see this theme elsewhere, like in Galatians chapter 2, where Paul challenged Peter publicly at what we might call a segregated lunch counter. And we also see this theme with regard to the temple in Jesus' teaching in John chapter 4, where Jesus spoke of a new temple better than Jewish or Samaritan holy sites. But here in Ephesians chapter 2, we can think especially of the Old Testament background. The Old Testament didn't segregate Gentiles from Jews in the outer court of the temple. You had the holiest place that was for God alone. You then had the priestly sanctuary, and then the outer court. Everybody was welcome. In the temple, in fact, Solomon prayed in 1 Kings chapter 8 that everybody would feel welcome, Gentiles would feel welcome in this place. But due to purity regulations and the priestly interpretation of them, Herod's temple segregated Gentiles from Jews. The outer court was now divided into three sections. You had the court of Israel for Jewish men. Outside that, in a lower level and somewhat less pure, you had the court of women for Jewish women. And beyond that, you had the new outer court, a place beyond which Gentiles couldn't go. In fact, there were nice welcome signs welcoming the Gentiles by saying, any Gentile who goes beyond this point will be responsible for their death, which will shortly ensue. Josephus talks about that, and archaeologists even found one of those signs. In Acts chapter 21, Paul was actually accused of having taken a Gentile beyond that point. Some Ephesian Jews saw Paul exiting the temple. They knew him because he'd split their synagogue back in Acts chapter 19, preaching about Jesus. Some of the synagogue agreed with him, some of them didn't. The ones who didn't agree with him didn't like him, and they also thought that he had stirred up the riot in Ephesus that they got blamed for. So now they see him in Jerusalem with Trophimus, a Gentile, and when they see him in the temple, they assume that this Gentile is still with him. Well, Paul didn't violate that custom, but they thought he did, and they started a riot. And Paul ended up, for this reason, in Roman custody. So Paul preaches to them, and everybody's listening to him up until the point where he says, God sent me to the Gentiles, and then the riot starts again. So when Paul is in Roman custody, the people in and around Ephesus, the people in that part of Asia Minor, they know why Paul's in Roman custody, why Paul is writing to them from Roman detention, because he was accused of having violated this dividing wall of partition in the temple. Paul was held for 2 years in Caesarea, then shipped off to Rome. And when he was shipped off to Rome, it was shortly after that Caesarea erupted in riots between Jews and Gentiles. For Paul and for his audience, there could be no greater symbol of this division between Jew and Gentile than this dividing wall in the temple. And yet Paul declares in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 14 that this dividing wall that was set up by purity regulations has been shattered by Jesus Christ. Now, this was in the days when it wasn't popular to be talking about ethnic reconciliation. Paul is running around the Roman Empire saying, with regard to salvation, there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. And a few years later, Jews and Syrians are massacring each other in the streets of Caesarea. Within a decade, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem's temple and enslaved its survivors. This wasn't a time when it was popular to talk about ethnic reconciliation, but that's what Paul talks about in this new temple in Christ. Paul goes on to speak more explicitly about this new temple in verses 21 and 22 of Ephesians 2. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. In him you too are being built together as a dwelling place of God's Spirit. Now, at this point, it may be helpful also to consider Jesus' relation to the temple.